It is my pleasure now to introduce John L. Jackson, Jr., who is our first speaker today. As many of you know, Zora Neale Hurston was the first trained African-American anthropologist. Unfortunately, even though she worked with one of the pioneers in the field, Columbia professor Franz Boas, she was discouraged by her primary patron from formally studying for a PhD in anthropology. Yet, her training in ethnographic methodology, including the collection of folklore and culture ways via film and audio recording, informs all of her work. Also trained in Columbia's anthropology department, our first keynote speaker, John L. Jackson, Jr., is the Richard Perry University Professor of Communication, Anthropology, and Africana Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, as well as Dean of the School of Social Policy and Practice. John is similarly a pioneer in the field, particularly in the way in which he has championed film and multimodal media making as not merely tools of anthropology, but as a primary medium of anthropological and intellectual inquiry in and of itself. He is also widely known for his dynamic engagement with critical race studies, books that I treasure, as evident in his publications, Harlem World, Doing Race and Class in Contemporary Black America, Real Black, Adventures in Racial Sincerity, and Racial Paranoia, the unintended consequences of political correctness. Along with Deborah Thomas, our afternoon keynote speaker today, he is the co-creator of the non-fictional film Bad Friday, Rastafari After Coral Gardens. Finally, I'm also grateful to him for a trenchant article, you can look this up, he wrote last year in the Chronicle of Education on being Black in the Academy. Professor Jackson's talk this morning is titled Thick Description, How Taking Film Seriously Should Change Ethnography. Please welcome Professor John L. Jackson, Jr.
Good morning. Thank you for that introduction. It's always good to be back home. And by back home, I do mean Barnard and Columbia. There's so much about my own road through the academy that's simply and exclusively about the continuing legacy of Zora Neale Hurston. So I do feel like I'm one of these folks who, I write a little bit about Zora. So in the first book, and a little bit in the second, I talk about the extent to which it was really difficult for me to do what is the quintessential, fundamental, methodological move we make in anthropology, which is field work, i.e. talking to people you don't know about their lives and world, because I'm incredibly shy. I'm still shy. I can do the method, but I still tell people I'm the shyest person I know. And in the books, what I tried to describe to readers was the kind of almost psychological contortions I had to do with myself to compel me into my field site. And I did my work here in Harlem. I didn't do it with calipers measuring heads like Zora did, but I did it here in Harlem. And I remember one of the first moves I made, because of course I knew about Zora before I arrived, mostly because I did my undergrad at Howard. So, we talk about Zora there too, before I got up here, and they talk about Zora. And I remember thinking, you know what, if Zora can do the kind of research she does, and do it fearlessly, do it boldly, I have no excuse for not going up on 125th Street and handling my, and I really channel Zora, and I talk about this in the book. Eventually, I imagined that what I wanted to do was almost create this alter ego superhero that I called Anthro Man. But Anthro Man is really just Zora dressed up in a tight suit with a mask on. And invariably, when the discipline of anthropology pushes back, and part of really, in a nutshell, what I'm going to offer up this morning is just an argument about how anthropology, at least right now in 2016, I'm optimistic, but I still think it's true, is finally catching up with Zora in the way she understood cultural analysis and the way she used many different mechanisms to render cultural worlds. I think we're almost there. We're catching up with her now. But in the past and the present, when it pushes back against creativity and innovation, when it pushes back against attempts to go against convention, I hold, and I'm not the only person who does this, you hold on to Zora for the courage to push back and to say, absolutely, this is valuable. And I'm not going to let anyone tell me it's not. And so really, that's the subtext for the talk. And it does, in a way, begin at Columbia University when I was a graduate student, only because the only reason why I was even accepted to Columbia at the time when I applied, which wasn't that long ago, although maybe it seems like it, is because I was working in film. And I wrote this really cheesy and horrible statement of purpose to them about how I wanted to use a film camera, go around the world, and depict people's stories. I said, Howard taught me how to make films. And this is when film wasn't just a metaphor, right? We were actually recording things photochemically, right? Sending them to a lab, keeping our fingers crossed, hoping we got the right exposure, editing them linearly, right? One clip after another. So this is when it was still film, right? Now we're talking about digital video. But at the moment, I knew I could make film. Howard taught me how to do that. What I felt like I needed, and I imagined anthropology could provide it, was I needed an analytical lens for thinking about the most constructive, the most productive, and the most impactful way to tell those stories in images and sound. And I said, anthropology might help me with that. And that's really naively what I told them I wanted to do, in all this purpley prose and sort of horrible metaphors about what film cameras can do and be. And of course, when you get into graduate programs, it's all about what we call fit, right? And fit can be a euphemism for a whole bunch of things, but one of the things it means is, does anybody want to work with you when you get here? Or is anyone going to take responsibility for you when you're here? And it just so happened that they hired, unbeknownst to me, someone who's going to specialize in film and anthropology. They were going to come in the year I would start. So like, wow, look at this, serendipity. We'll bring them together. And that's, if they hadn't hired that person, I guarantee you I would not have gotten into anthropology at Columbia University. And so they were really excited about this kind of filmic emphasis they were going to have with at least one grad student and one faculty member. It became pretty clear to me, probably within a week of arriving on campus, that they would be happy with me picking up a film camera again once I got tenure somewhere. Right? Between that moment and tenure, they wanted me to write exclusively. And not only that, it was clear that if I wasn't writing, because that's what academics do, right? We write. Then there must be some disconnect between the professional path I've taken and whatever is my kind of really passionate internal commitment to being some sort of cultural producer in the world. I must just want to be a filmmaker, and I'm going to be here kind of under false pretenses. So once it was clear they didn't want me to really work in film until much later, I'm stubborn enough that I just kept doing it anyway. But I did it under the cover of darkness. Right? Again, thinking about all the ways in which my job was to be true to what brought me there, to what I wanted to produce. Again, holding on to relying on Zora. And this is even in spite of the fact that anthropology, the reason why I chose the discipline, is because it has a history of investing in the power of filmmaking and film cameras, both methodologically, but also kind of analytically and theoretically. That's Boaz, that's Zora. We're going to watch some of her films later. So even the discipline in the academy that should be most receptive to the idea of deploying a camera to do the work you do was saying, not while you're here, and really, it shouldn't be until after you've gotten tenure somewhere, decades later. And so I decided I was going to do it anyway. I just did it all under the cover of darkness. So I didn't tell my advisor, didn't tell my dissertation committee. I swore the other grad students to secret they couldn't tell anybody. Because I knew the response would be, well, I guess he's a good enough kid, he could probably get the degree done, but he must not really want to be here. This isn't who we are. We're not filmmakers. And in some ways, part of what my entire career has been about is trying to figure out why there's that commitment to shunning versions of what we've been calling multimodal scholarship, ways of talking about anthropological analysis that draws on all the various mechanisms and technologies and techniques we can use to render and represent people's cultural universes. And so I did it anyway, and actually didn't come out to my advisor as a filmmaker until I was on my postdoc and done with the dissertation. But I kept thinking about how and why it made sense to push the field. Again, the way Zora pushed anthropology in the ways and I'm going to talk about at the end exactly why I think Zora is a good way to frame this move to multimodality. And so ultimately, one of the things, and I have maybe 4 major points. One of the things I would emphasize is the title of the talk, Thick Depiction, is clearly a play on thick description, which if you're an anthropologist, comes out of Clifford Geertz. Even if you're not an interpretive anthropologist the way Geertz was, and most folks aren't, you deploy this notion of thickness as a way to explain what we imagine to be the rigor of anthropological analysis of culture and the maybe more trivial, superficial attempts by others in other parts of the academy. right? So thickness is this way to police the difference between an anthropological understanding of someone's cultural and social world and other attempts to render those worlds, we argue, less sophisticatedly, less thickly. And part of the point of thick depiction, and just so you're clear, I don't know how many anthropologists are in the room, Gilbert, one of the things that Gertz does is pull this from this British philosopher, one of these ordinary language philosophers coming out of Wittgenstein and others, this guy named Gilbert Ryle. He even stole the sort of master metaphor for why thickness was better than thinness from Ryle. And it was this idea of the contracting eyelid, right? This, which can be, you all don't know if you can see me, but I'm blinking my eyes. It can be a blink, right? It can be a blink. It can be a twitch, right? It can be a wink that's a romantic wink, a wink that's more conspiratorial. And the idea, the basic point that Gertz is making, pulling from Ryle, is that just looking at that contracting eyelid doesn't tell you what the action means. You won't know what it means, right? That the eye alone, and by extension, and they invoke the camera explicitly, and by extension, the camera can't render a cultural universe thickly, only thinly. So to show you the movement, but you'll need something else, and really someone else, the anthropologist, right, to come and explain to you what that behavior actually is signaling. Ryle and Gertz even go so far as to say it's unphotographable what culture is. Unphotographable. Because you can't simply see it. There's something else that has to go on for you to make sense out of it. So the eye is inadequate. The camera, let alone not just being non-self-evidential, it can't get you the meaning you want, not on its own. One of the classic films in anthropology, one of the ways you can parse its intervention, this film called The Axe Fight, which came out about 1975 by Napoleon Chagnon and Timothy Ash. That film is specifically about trying to operationalize the inadequacy of a film camera. Doing it in film, right? So it's a film about what the film camera, qua camera, on its own, can't tell you about a cultural world. And one of the ways they structure it is to show you a scene. So this is all in Venezuela in South America, a group that was called the Yanomami at the time. Show you a scene of this really violent exchange among this community. Right, you just see it. The camera's rolling. You capture all of this action, interaction, violence, threats. Then there's a second iteration of the same phenomenon where the filmmakers explain to you what you didn't see the first time, what you don't know simply by looking through the arc of the film, the composition in the camera, and all the other ways in which they, as filmmakers, can help you understand what's really happening in an other than superficial way. And then they kind of top it off at the end by showing you an edited version of the film much later on with all of the contextual cues and handles you need to hold on to truly understand from an anthropological perspective exactly what that fight was about and what it entailed. What you couldn't have seen simply by turning the camera on. Axe Fight, classic film. Students tell me unwatchable because it's so boring. But it's a really useful way to demonstrate this critique of the film camera and its thinness. And my position, and it's a position I think that really pushes back against this central presupposition about the thinness of the screen, is to argue that actually part of what makes not just anthropologists, but all academics terrified, I would argue, sounds maybe a little histrionic, but terrified of the filmic image is not because it's thin and superficial, as Ryle and Gertz and others might argue, but because the image and what's in the diegesis that you see is so incredibly, undomesticatably thick, right? What do I mean by that? One example of how, at least in the context of trying to teach film to grad students at Penn, we began to distill why the stakes of this discussion matter at all. So one of the things we've been doing at Penn for a while, maybe I'll talk a little bit more about this before I close, is trying to bring in academic filmmakers, folks who work in images and sound and use that work to further their own interventions, their contributions to the literature, right, the literature. And there was one film, and I won't, just because I don't want to blow up this filmmaker's spot, I won't give you any identifying details about the film, because it's going to sound like this really vicious critique, but it's not meant in that spirit. It's meant to identify some of the differences between what you can do with a blank page and what you can do and can't do with a film camera. So we brought in all these filmmakers, and one filmmaker who did this interesting project with HIV patients at we'll call it a third world, quote unquote, hospital in a place I will not name, wrote this incredibly powerful essay, published incredibly powerful essay about this community and about her relationship to some of the patients there, and about how the patients talk about, theorize vernacularly their own institutionalization, their relationship to the doctors, their relationships to one another, their understanding of what this illness even entails, right? So all these wonderful, really a fascinating article. And just so you know, it's not HIV, so you can't even look that up and find the article and think you'll find the filmmaker. So I've changed it. Very, very good. Academics were very good at trying to anonymize, right, and keep confidentiality. So that won't get you there. But what this person also did was send us ahead of time a short documentary film about the same topic, same place, same people. And we watched the film and read the article together and talked to the filmmaker. And talked to the filmmaker about what we thought was this wonderful, wonderful and powerful disconnect between the article and the film. Because what you see in the film that doesn't come up at all, not even in a footnote in the article, was that this filmmaker and anthropologist, key informant, primary informant, was a white missionary from the West, who clearly was the conduit for all of these interactions. Couldn't have been possible, I think, for her to have gotten the access to the things that he got the access to, simply because of this wonderful, amazing, powerful attempt to engage what was and still is an incredibly timely and significant subject matter. Wouldn't have gotten access, no matter how powerful it was, no matter how much he or she was invested, clearly without this primary figure, who really, for all intents and purposes, is our main narrator of this film. Takes us through the entire project, And so for us, it was telling, right, to say that on a blank page, someone has the agency to completely invisibilize this key participant. Whereas it would take a different kind of work, a work they weren't willing or able to do or see, to do it on film. I'm not saying it's impossible, right? But if you're in that space, one of the things you're doing is tied indexically to that space in ways you're not quite tied to in the same way with a blank page. Right? So we just thought that was an incredibly important learning moment for us, because there are tons of things, not even consciously, we take out of our written text because we can. We can play God. Now, we're also gods of a sort with the film camera. We decide it. We make the story. But the rules and regulations about how we laud our sort of deified power is much different in images and sound. So for us, that was an important and learning moment. Because what it really meant to us was there's also a kind of ethical implication to that move, to that register, to that distinction between writing and filming. And we kind of knew that, right? And it in some ways clearly outstrips anything IRB asks us to think about vis-a-vis the ethics of the work we do. And IRB is still trying to catch up with what to do with images and audio and all this kind of thing. But what I really would want to hammer home is this notion that not only do we have to engage the field differently with the camera on our shoulder, right, or in the palm of our hands, as small as they've gotten, but if I were to throw up any image, and we'll look at images later of Zora's films, one of the things you recognize is that if you stop any frame, at any point, you're seeing what someone like Michael Taussig would have called the inescapability of chance as the organizing principle for what makes ethnography possible. And what do I mean by that? I simply mean, talk to any director, and directors are clearly infamous for being control freaks vis-a-vis the way they want to render their stories, fiction or nonfiction. But if you watch any film more than once, right, if you watch any film enough times that you stop being distracted by the main narrative, by the power of particular performances, and you start to see things that you wouldn't otherwise see, right? And I always tell my films, I always tell my students, you haven't watched a film until you've seen it 10 times. Because then you're no longer captivated by what the director, exclusively at least, by what the director wants to privilege. You're able to see crevices in the screen that weren't necessarily meant for viewing. That's fiction or nonfiction. And so there's a way in which, if you stop at any screen, what you'll recognize is, and it can, it can be a short interview of someone, I'm going to invoke Deb's film, someone who lost a loved one, probably as a function of extrajudicial state violence in Jamaica, talking about how that happened, trying to contain him or herself, giving us a narrative about the moment. And what we're watching and hearing is so much more than simply what we transcribe on the page. And it's that extra stuff that, especially as academics, we are terrified that we can't control. And I knew this almost instinctively as a grad student. So when I was finishing up and going on the market and started to do research with a group of African Americans who've been in Israel now for over 40 years, I didn't feel confident that I could show any audience, let alone a mixed audience of folks who aren't African American, who don't think about the world in any of the ways that the community that I study in Israel think about the world, that I could show any image that they wouldn't be able to contort in service to their own already stigmatizing notions of African American difference. Because I knew there's so much baggage there. And in every twitch or blink or movement of the eye or inflection in the voice, there are things you can read that on the printed page you can quite purposefully control and control for. But the camera doesn't give you the same latitude for organizing. And so I just decided for years I simply wasn't going to show anything, because I didn't have the time to feel like I could equip viewers with what they needed to know to watch it in a way that wasn't going to reinforce their own stereotyped understanding of black difference. And so that, for me, again, early on, before I even started writing or talking about it, was one small example of what's so frightening about film video. Because no matter what you might want to do, you can't control for everything. And there are ways the viewers can read into these images, read into these screens that are completely beyond your capacity to control. One of the reasons why I think writing becomes so difficult for so many people is we want to imagine we can determine definitively the single solitary way our words can be interpreted. Right? We don't want it to be misconstrued. We don't want folks to take it in directions we didn't anticipate or we wouldn't condone. And even when we do that, even when we, completely divorce it of all affect and emotion and inflection and volatility, we sanitize it to death, right? We make it sound like, dead academic jargony writing. Even in that context, we can't stop people from appropriating in ways we wouldn't have anticipated. And so what I like about the idea of thinking multimodally, and why I'm so excited about what we've been doing at Penn for the last 10 years, is I do think we're in a moment now where we've caught up to the kind of sensibility that Zora Neale Hurston represents. And so we're used to talking about Zora in terms of vernacularity, right? How she's using languages from the community. She's fearless about trying to represent the voice of poor black folks in their own dialect and register. And there was something about that that was very political and problematic to folks at the time. And I think vernacularity is still a nice framing for what her intervention is. But she's also always operating, Zora, multimodally. Right? So she's working in film. We'll see some of those films. She's writing fiction. She's not just writing fiction, she's doing autobiography. She's working in the theater. She's singing her own text for public consumption. Like, Zora's doing everything. And doing it in a way that says, ultimately, it's not about whether or not my colleagues feel comfortable with this. It's about trying to get it right and trying to take it seriously, give it the kind of seriousness it deserves, and it will demand everything I have. So say what you will about any particular text that Zora produces, one of the things she teaches, I think, the anthropologists in the contemporary moment is you are not giving yourself what you need to be successful if you're trying to hamstring your production simply to the printed word on a page in some journal somewhere. even a popular book, might not have enough expansiveness to accommodate what you need to do to get the work right. And Zora knew that. She knew it so well. She knew it implicitly. And I'm most proud, I would say, about the kind of sea change I've seen in the academy, especially in anthropology, though not exclusively then, between when I was a grad student and I knew if I was going to make films, nobody could know about it, versus the kind of dissertational experience our grad students are having at Penn, where a ton of them are making films in the bright light of day. They're saying these films are constitutive of their academic identities. And one of my students 3 years ago became the first student in the history of the University of Pennsylvania, over 270 plus years, to graduate from the university with an all-visual dissertation. All film. Never happened before. And there are dozens of students coming behind her. I'll also say it's not inconsequential that it was a her of color, who probably wouldn't have felt like she wanted to stay in the academy unless it provided the opportunity to do work like that. So all these implications for inclusion and diversity as well. So I think that's also important that we under-thematize that when we talk about the value of this stuff. And so what we're trying to think about now is how do we get the academy to go into what I argue is the future of us all. Right? If we were to write some sci-fi story about what the academy looks like 25 years from now, maybe it's 35, maybe it's 50, maybe it's 10. I'm not sure there are any books anywhere where we're all working multimodally. Right? We're all thinking in images and sound. We're all trying to engage one another in all these others that are completely beyond us now, but that's where we're headed. And so my argument is, and this again, an argument that I feel confident to make because Zora, in a sense, has already made it, is that either we go into that future kicking and screaming, right, or proactively trying to understand how do we organize our approach to this material so that we get it right, that we know what rigor looks like. Like for us, the big thing that we talk about is Penn. Anthropologists have been making films for a long time. They've just been making really horrible films. I mean, just unwatchable films. And why? Because they don't take it as seriously as the preciousness of the page. Again, they write horribly too, but they don't think it's horrible. I think they know the films aren't as good. But it doesn't matter as much, right? It doesn't count when you go up for tenure, right? It's not real scholarship. We've been saying, oh, that is scholarship. And anything else is wrong-headed and antiquated. And so for us, it's about trying to figure out what's the criteria we use to think about not just whether or not we make films, but what's a film that's made with a kind of virtuosity that we know Zora thought was very important. Right? That's rigorous, that's careful, that's thoughtful, not just thrown together, right? It speaks for itself, it doesn't. Right? That's also what's so amazing and counterintuitive about film. Right? We think you just watch it and it does the work. Part of what it demands is even more literacy, visual literacy we call it, to understand what's happening. Right? The cottage industry for film used to always be, what? Is it really that late? I'm going to stop soon. It used to always be, propaganda, right? Because part of what makes, again, another reason why we're so terrified of it is it's used in political ideological context to do some really horrific things. Because it does deploy affect, right, not just reason, and puts them together in this way that's hard to disentangle. But ultimately, I guess my point is simply to say, what I love about Zora and why I continue to work and why you can't get 3 anthropologists of color together in the room and not after a couple minutes hear Zora float through the conversation somewhere. Because she's someone who makes it okay to think in these ways. Because she's done it. And even before she was reclaimed and recuperated, she did it because she knew she had to do the work well. And so that's why I feel like whether or not people care, whether or not they think it's anthropology, whether or not it's respected in certain circles and precincts in academia, I know it's important because it allows us to talk about and think about things vis-a-vis the communities I care about and write about that wouldn't be possible if I hamstrung myself simply to the printing page. And again, and just the final note, and clearly for Zora, and I would say for me as well, not because I don't like to write, Zora loves to write. The idea is not imagining that the way you're taught to quote unquote write in the academy is the only proper register to use if you're talking honestly about people's social worlds. It isn't. You can deploy it if you want, but one of the first things I always tell grad students is your job is to unlearn it once you're done and to use it strategically when you know you can deploy it for a very specific aim. So again, Zora, both explicitly in reading her work, but also always trying to make sure I'm in conversation with her ethos, is someone who I think is the patron saint of trying to understand a version of anthropological possibility that isn't marginalized, isn't impoverished by this small-scale notion of the writerly anthropological self. So I'll stop there. Thank you all. That's a great question. And so my answer is no, except, so I can tell you how I think about rightness in this context. So it isn't some understanding of an objectively articulated and construed finish line of epistemological possibility. It's really about saying, what do I need to learn? Am I learning it through the process of producing this? And are other people also able to learn something that wasn't maybe understandable or even intelligible before? No matter how you slice it, the paradigm's always going to shift. We're always going to realize we're wrong. We'll have sort of new conceptual frameworks to make sense of the world that are very radically different from the stuff people took for granted before. But I think a notion of rightness is one that simply says it's okay to imagine your first order of business is to kind of deconstruct the taken for granted and the obvious of the contemporary moment, right? So what is status quo? Again, it's not anything goes, but I do feel like, for me, what's right is a version of trying, even as a writer, let alone as a filmmaker, to represent the stuff I've experienced under the auspices of anthropological research in ways that I really think does justice to the experience itself and to the perspectives of the folks who experienced it with me in some sort of interactional, intersubjective way. That's my version of writing that stuff up, which may or may not link to sort of phenomenological assumptions about how we, but ultimately, I think for me, right means people read it and they haven't quite heard it before, may not agree with all of it, but think it was worth engaging. It makes people think about the stuff they've always talked about before in a slightly different way. And to me, that's a version of rightness that still, I think, pivots on this sense of sort of anthropological generosity and inclusiveness and lack of sort of brutal hierarchical manipulation, right? There's so much about the history of anthropology is about constructing and investing in institutionalized forms of separating and hierarchizing communities. I want to argue that we're still sort of doing penance for that now in our attempt to constantly talk about race being a social construction, all the reasons why it's not as real as we once said it was. I think our job is to figure out ways in which the discussion, even about race and its non-biological moorings, is about so much more than social constructionism, so much more than deconstruction. It's about trying to see how people live with this stuff. And for me, I think it's why I like film. I'm acting like there's a film. I think it's why I like film, because the one thing I think right also means for me is to say we have to be sort of thinking, especially about issues of race, but other things as well, thinking, but also realizing that the way out of these binds we've created for ourselves aren't simply about cognition, right? So we're not going to think ourselves or reason ourselves out of the stuff that's important. So this link between what we think we know and what we've learned in kind of intellectual, reason, cognitive sense, and what we feel, right? What's in our gut. And that's why I also like this notion of chance or serendipity that Tausig and others play with, because I think there's something about trying to put those two things together again in the context of ethnographic writing and representation that to me is also a version of right. Doesn't mean we all do it the same way. Doesn't mean it's even an accurate or fair depiction of what is, in some ontological sense, in the world. But it does mean saying we don't have a chance of getting close to right if we imagine we're going to short circuit that link between sort of what we think we can intellectualize and the ways in which intellectuality is always embedded, nested in this sense of affective connection and emotionality. So for me, right is some version of thinking those things and keeping them in tension in some kind of constructive and productive way. But I know that's not a very fulfilling answer, but the short answer was, you're right, there is no right? There's no Manichaean point from which I can determine that, but I do ultimately believe that for me, the version of right I find most powerful, again, the version I think Zora incarnates so magnificently, is one that says you have to be hearing and feeling and seeing and playing all at one and the same time. And it takes all of your body, all of your instincts, all of yourself to even get close to it, right, and to try to feel it, or something like that.
You talked about film and how it affects our visual anthropological cultural experience. What about some of the new technologies when we talk about holographic technologies, when we talk about even 3D? How does that affect our visual experience in a cultural and historical setting? And how do you see it moving from film to these other new technologies?
That's a great question. I even have less of a good answer for that one than I had for the one before. So we've been right now starting to do a lot of VR stuff with grad students, but also with some consultants around in Philadelphia. I mean, I think if nothing else, one of the things it does is it gives us, in a really emphatic way, license to imagine we can push ourselves even farther from the printed page, right? Again, and in some ways I also feel it's unfair to set up that binary, right, between sort of the printed page, which was yesterday, and all these other new wonderful possibilities that are virtual and interactive and all in the future. I think it's not that cut and dry, and it's not fair to do that. But I do believe that the more we take seriously the contemporary mediatized environment, the more we know that what we're asking is a kind of quintessential anthropological question, which is how does all of this stuff make being human different from what it felt like even 10 years ago, let alone 100, let alone when Zora was walking around up here. And so I think that's, in some ways, an empirical question. It's an analytical, theoretical one, but it's also an empirical question. And I think the more we pick those particular technologies up and try to see what they allow us to do, the more we'll get a sense, not just of sort of how they change, if they do at all, our species being in some way, but also, and maybe even for us in a more close-quartered way, more practically, how they provide us with more opportunities to maybe not get it right, per se, but to do the work we do in a way that both brings in more interlocutors. There's a version of public intellectualism that might be at stake here, but also that actually allows us to potentially ask newfangled questions, to package answers in ways that would have been impossible for the folks who came before us. And I think there are versions of that kind of dynamic that leads me to always think about how we need to retool as academics who tend to be conservative about all this stuff, right? Always the last people, but they're the last adopters, right? And I think there's a way in which if we're smart, and I think some folks take this on quite effectively in the academy, we realize our job now, and there are folks who are working specifically on this, they might call themselves media anthropologists and others, is to figure out what all this new stuff can allow us to say about the kind of dynamics we create as cultural communities. And so ultimately I think it's an open question, but I do believe that the more we embrace the attempt to ask and answer it, as opposed to pretend it away and imagine, well, that's never going to be relevant, that's kind of superficial, silly, playful stuff, the more we actually take it seriously, and which is great about anthropology, right? I like anthropology because there is no real distinction between high culture and low culture, right? Opera and Luke Cage on Netflix, both culturally relevant and ambassadors for the university. I mean, both equally useful as cultural texts, right? Anthropologists are not a respecter of that kind of hierarchy when we're talking about cultural relevance. And so I think taking that approach and that perspective vis-a-vis these new technologies will allow us to do some, I think, wonderful things in academic and anthropological circles that we haven't been able to do before.
So you were talking earlier about how you teach film students to watch a film, how you have to watch a film at least 10 times to really get past maybe the directorial focus or a powerful actor's performance to get to the parts of the film that maybe you're not supposed to see, which when you were talking about maybe undomesticatable thickness, that's what sort of made me think of that. So when you get to these points of where you're not supposed to see what you're seeing, does that get at what you're talking about in terms of the right, where you're sort of feeling and seeing and playing all at the same time?
That's a good question. I mean, so there's a very trivial way in which your eyes open up. But we used to always do this when I was at Howard in film school. Once you've seen, and even if it's a film you love, right? There are tons of films we would watch over and over again because we just love those films. And even for films you love, you realize there's stuff you see that's crazy, right? And it's not just the boom mic coming in the frame, which you wouldn't have seen the first 15 times you watched the film, but it's all this other stuff that clearly is out of place, right? I would talk about it this way. I would say, so there's a version of it that's simply about saying, you see all of these weird disconnects, right, that are disoriented, right? And it's a version of, I think, what someone like Roland Barthes would have talked about as the distinction between the studium, and he's talking about still images, but I think you can still apply it in some ways to the moving image, the studium and the punctum. So if in the studium is all the stuff that kind of was both maybe purposely put in the frame, but also that represents the cultural landscape in this very almost ethnographic way, right? So all of the elements, the details in the image, in that composition, that tell you something about that world, right? Tell you something about the people who are being depicted, about the kind of community they inhabit, all of that stuff. That's the studium. And that's important. We spend a lot of time talking about, and it's one of the reasons why, we say, and it sounds quite sort of trite and like a platitude, but a picture's worth 1,000 words, right? Because you look at any image, no matter what it is, and there's so many ways to slice into it and out of it, so many things you see. Most of what you see and what you're playing with, someone like Bart would say, would be that studium version of what's possible to spy. But he also talks about what he calls the punctum, and he tries to theorize and think about it in different ways. Ultimately, he wants to say it's the part of what you see that actually pricks you, right, that pokes you, that makes you uncomfortable, that gives you pause. His punchline ultimately is to say it's what existentially reminds you of your own mortality, of the fact that you're going to die. He says every film, in a sense, every photograph is a spirit photograph. It shows you dead people. It shows you yourself ultimately dying, right? That's kind of his punchline by the end of this little short book he does where he writes about his mom and a photograph of his mom. And in some ways, what is he talking about? He's talking about the fact that, no matter sort of what you take an image of in the world, its indexical relationship to what was in front of the camera at the time has changed. Right? So the stuff is no longer in place. It's moved. For the images he was showing us, these images of folks who actually were literally long dead. They were gone. And so for him, there's a thickness to and a rightness to making sense of these images that's really about this kind of existential realization of our own mortality, of the fact that no matter how you look at it, no matter how you think about it, what we always show ourselves is the fact that we are finite beings, right? And that haunts us, he says, all the time. So now that's even a different kind of thickness than maybe what I highlighted before, but I think it's in the same conversation. So I think to be able to get at, in an anthropological way, things that prick the reader or the viewer, that give them pause, that make them feel something rich and strong and real or something, to me is a version maybe of what right might look like. And I think to try to even aspire to that level of engagement with your audience, I think it's a pretty important thing. Again, not everyone has to do it, so I'm not doctrinaire about it. If you don't want to do that, don't do that. But all I'm saying is, don't disqualify people from being here because they do want to do that. And let's figure out what criteria we use so we're comfortable with how we delineate between better and worse ways of doing that, right? And I think that's the version of having a different project, a different end game, that Zora is a really, for me at least, really good person to use in the context of this pushback against all these complicated ways in which academics who aren't trained in filmmaking, who clearly don't want to see emotion in that way unfurled and in front. Like, you're uncomfortable, but that doesn't mean we can't do this work, and it doesn't push anthropology into places that are incredibly fertile and useful for the discipline to go. So I think it's a nice way to think about it. It's to say, well, this rightness is about some version of trying to hit people in this way that they can't forget. And that shakes them in some ways out of their stupor enough that they start to think about themselves and their lives differently. The other thing anthropology is good at is being very self-reflexive. So being able to get the viewer, right? So we're so fascinated, right, in being vicarious. We're looking at other people, other images. But to be able to prick someone so that they actually realize they're simply looking at themselves, but differently. And that, to me, is also a version of getting it right. So I try to do that both in writing, but I think also in the ways in which you bring some of those ideas to the screen, or we do audio ethnographies, so the kind of sound landscapes and acoustic ethnographic things that people produce as well.
So we've been celebrating the kind of the multimodal Zora, and the way you framed it is that she brings everything. She's doing everything. She's kind of doing the most. And that made me think of the kind of way that, of side hustles, the idea of side hustles. And you were talking about the fact that we don't quite pay enough attention to the racialized and gendered dimensions of this kind of multimodal practice. And it made me flash on kind of some of the like sadder moments in Zora Neale Hurston's life, like when she's, has an astrology column at the end of her life and is working as a maid, and the kind of little places where she makes these creative interventions feel like they're also connected to a kind of economic and social precarity. And I'm wondering what you see, and I don't think it's an either or. I think there is a kind of uncontainable creative efflorescence, but I'm wondering if you have anything to say about sort of the role of precarity in fostering this range of modes of expression.
That's a great question. So there are a lot of ways I guess I could answer it. Maybe the best way to start, I would say, is to just reinforce the idea that one of the reasons why it's so important to me that we have students at Penn who don't have to hide the fact that they're doing this, and the work they're doing is in film, but they're also doing graphic novels, they're also doing performances. I mean, they're doing a ton of different stuff as scholars, right? Not as a side hustle per se, but as something that they want to imagine is central to what their intervention is within the academy, right? And so what I like about this move we've made, again, I wasn't a grad student that long ago, is that one of the things it does is it says a way to sort of push back or sort of in some ways temper some of that precarity is to force the institutions with the power to actually recognize the value of this kind of work, right? And so, I mean, I think part of, there are a whole bunch of ways people talk about Zora as being very angular and eccentric and charismatic. All this stuff, the Academy would have had a hard time with her no matter what she wrote or did, right? And I think there's a version of how we can think through institutions. And institutions are always going to be conservative. They're always going to be slow-moving. They're never going to be particularly nimble with this stuff. But I think we've been able to at least have some success at Penn, and I think it's part of a larger national movement. So every year the students bring in, activists, artists, academics who work multimodally every spring. I think next year is the 17th and 18th. We call it the Screening Scholarship Media Festival. And it's a space where both we validate one another, we remind ourselves that there's a critical mass of people doing this stuff, right? So what's great about what Zora has when she's in Harlem is she has the Harlem Renaissance crew, right? So you have a critical mass of folks that's not just in Philadelphia, not even just in the US, but international, and thinking through all the implications of this stuff in this global way. But then on top of that, trying to make sure that the institution recognizes two things that it does value. One is that we can attract many more interesting students if we take this seriously and they know they can do this here, right? And I think that's a real legitimate argument to an institution. But also that we can be very confident that we can assess the material in ways that can adjudicate the difference between folks who are doing it well. Again, doesn't mean it's one size fits all and you have to do it, there's a Penn way of doing it, it means saying, how do we make sure we're separating the folks who are actually rolling up their sleeves and doing the work from the kind of anthropologists of old who just kind of imagine if I'm not writing the article for the premier journal in the field, I can do whatever. It's not that significant. And so that, to me, we've had some very successful wins on those fronts. And what it means, I hope, and what it's already started to mean for some of the students who've graduated, is that they don't have to imagine once they leave they're not going to get a job. Right? They're not going to be able to make a living in the academy doing this kind of work. Right? So that for us really is the next frontier, and we're sort of slowly getting there. So we know we've gotten the students what they need at the institution to produce this work. And at least the early returns are the folks who've started to graduate over the last 2 years are getting good jobs in good places. That's been good. But we want to make sure there are enough places and that there are enough sort of large-scale circulations of discourse about the legitimacy of this work that ultimately we know it will have a long-standing place within the academy. And to me, that's a version of trying to answer that precarity question, which says, I don't want these to be students who have to say, you know, I'm so frustrated, I can't do what I want to do, I'm not going to get tenure, but go out and do something else. Right? I'm gonna have to be an artist. I'm gonna have to work. You know, I mean, it's great if you want to be an artist. You don't have to be in the academy, right? But if you want to be here, it should be able to accommodate you. And we can't just rely on kind of contingencies of history about what genres we would champion and what we think are legitimate as a way to disqualify people and discount work that really can be just as rigorous. And if anything, you know, again, the irony is, you know, when you're making a film. So I remember when Deb and I did Bad Friday, we took it to all these film festivals. And I remember meeting a junior faculty person, woman of color, who was on West Coast Institution, also screening what was an amazing film. And all of her senior colleagues told her, great film, wish it had been a book, because then it would have counted. Now, and what's so amazing about that? Clearly, she did all the work she would have done for the book, and then some, right? Then she had to do all this other stuff, right? So, like, what's so wild about this scenario is it's not simply because of anything intrinsic to film that makes it not legitimate. The affordances of film allow you to do so much more in some ways. And you have to do more, right? You have to do the stuff you would have done for the book and then add these other layers on top of it. And so I think to be in a space where we can't allow ourselves to reproduce that kind of irrational response to people who are working in image and sound just because 50 years ago we didn't do that, that's like a bizarre position to hold. And I do think it's an impossible position to hold, too. And so what we've been very carefully doing is disabusing people of their assumptions about why that stuff isn't legitimate. And there's really no evidence they can really marshal to counter it, but it still takes work to push the institutions to where they need to go. And so ultimately, you know, if 10 years from now, you know, we probably, you know, I don't have about 35 students who've been doing this stuff at Penn over the last decade or almost decade. You know, if 10, 15 years from now, 20 years from now, we know these folks are doing what they want to do in the academy if that's where they want to stay, and most of them, it sounds like, do, then I feel like we've really turned a corner in a way that's going to allow for a way of thinking about what the academy can accommodate that says it's not either you sort of follow your passion, do what you want to do, engage in all this other virtual reality, all this stuff, or you get promoted and get tenure and get a job in the academy, right? That really, ultimately, you can do them both. And that part of, I think, what's so, again, poignant about Zora's story, the way she died in poverty, I mean, all that stuff is about what happens to people's real lives if we don't take this kind of stuff seriously. You know what I mean? So it is an intellectual, institutional question, but there's something so personal and intimate about it as well. And so we don't talk about that quite as much, but it's not lost on anyone that there are those kind of implications for the kind of institutional spaces we're trying to produce. So thanks. And maybe it makes sense to thematize that much more emphatically so people don't lose sight of it.
Mine is not a question this time for you to answer, but a comment, which refers to your discussion of the several genres and media that Zora herself used. I'm thinking of a comment made by not only a contemporary of Zora's, but a fellow anthropology student under Professor Boas with Hurston, who happens, and I knew this person because she was the mother of my dear friend Karen Cohen. So fellow anthropology student Lucy Kramer, who was also class of 1928 with Hurston, and in fact, when Hurston skipped town a couple of months earlier before graduation, having finished all her work, she needed to sell her gown that she'd already ordered, and Lucy Kramer needed to buy one, so Lucy bought her gown. But Lucy said to me once, you know, Zora was such a good anthropologist. We all thought it was such a pity that she turned to writing fiction. So I say that, of course, with all the love in the world, not as a critique, but but I think it fits in with your remarks about how the field has seen itself, has defined itself, and the necessary incorporation of multimodality and other genres and media. So just
That's
wanted
a great
to
point.
share that with you.
Thank you, thank you.
From a
And
fellow
there are,
Barnard.
and there are many more anthropologists working in fiction now. They're not writing as well as Zora writes, but they're trying, right? They're trying. Thank you.